This is Chapter 19 of Hattie Big Sky by Kirby Larson. August 1918. The Arlington News. Honyaker's Homily, Reaping What Was Sown. I could now give demonstrations at the State Agricultural College on cutting and threshing grain. Plug was joined by his pals, Joey and Star, as well as Wayne Robbins' horse, Sage. The foursome was hitched to the binder by these very hands after no small effort, and off they went through my wheat field. The flax had already been cut. That had been hard, as I hadn't been ready to give up my own little ocean. For that's what a field of flax in bloom looks like. Acres and acres of sea blue flowers, rippling in the August winds like waves. Now the horse-pulled machine cut a swath, literally, through the wheat. A reel feeds the standing grain into the sickle where it is cut. I do not know for certain what magic is worked inside the binder, but the final product is a tied bundle of grain. These bundles, shocks to us farmers, are left standing on the cut end to dry. After my first day of binding, I surveyed my kingdom with no less pleasure than any royal personage. In a few weeks' time, my neighbors will come to help thresh my grain. My grain. Are there any lovelier words in creation? You longtime farmers may laugh at my enthusiasm, but I ask you to think back to your first harvest. I believe you will have to admit to such feelings yourself. The first weeks of August brought rejuvenating rain. Then the weather turned even hotter. Thanks to help from Karl and Wayne Robbins, we were done binding my fields in a few days. I helped them as they helped me, and thus passed the weeks while my grain dried, standing in proud shocks in the field. The weather may have been good for the grain, but it did nothing for anyone's temper. Even my solid Plug balked when I tried to hitch him up to help at the Robbinses. That same night, I went in to fix supper. I set a plate on the table while I tried to think of something to make without cooking. In the few short minutes it took to scrounge up some food, the plate on the table had grown hot to the touch. After eating, I took the letter I was writing to Uncle Holt and sat on the stoop to finish it. Mr. Whiskers was stretched across the door jamb, spread out as long as he could be, trying to catch every possible breath of air to cool off. I reached down to scratch his belly, and he didn't even move. Karl says that with this heat, I wrote to my uncle, my grain will be ready to thresh in about 2 weeks. I'm glad I'm not growing corn. It would pop before I could harvest it. Outside, puffs of dust rose up above the coulee. Someone was coming on horseback. Maybe it was Wayne on his way home from hunting. Last week, he'd brought me 2 sage hens. But it wasn't Sage who trotted into view. This horse bore the tipped M brand. Sitting atop the range horse was Traft Martin. May I get some water for my horse? He called out, pulling up by the well. Certainly. I had no squabble with Trouble, no matter what my feelings might be about his rider. He pumped some water into the trough. Things are looking mighty dry around here. He pushed his hat back on his head. Mighty dry. Uh-huh. Hadn't I been lying awake nights, fretting over the very same thing? Once the grain was shocked and standing, there was always the fear of fire. You'll be threshing soon? In a few days. He nodded. Here the harvest over to Glendive was a disappointment. I could see where this is going. That's Glendive. He gave a grudging smile. And not here. Now I nodded. He swiped the back of his hand across his forehead and resituated his hat. It's not too late, he said. Too late? I parroted. For what? My offer. He hung the cup back up by the pump. I really am not interested. I tried to keep my tone even. Why was he pushing this point again? For the last time, I can't accept your offer. That's a big mistake on your part. His green eyes turned gray. I matched his stare with one of my own. I'd stood up to bullies before. Perhaps, but it's my mistake to make. He jerked at Trouble's reins. So you think. He rode out of the yard, my yard, for now. 2 days after Traft's visit, Karl and some other neighbors rumbled on to my place to start threshing. In the morning, I worked with the men in the fields. Then Leafy and Paralee came to help me bake for noon dinner. I suspect it was the promise of Paralee's pies, raisin and chokecherry and plum, that kept the crews working steadily. But my biscuits were respectable. Karl ate a half dozen himself. Oh, hun, that's only 'cause he needs some way to sop up Leafy's good buffalo berry jelly, Paralee teased. The children played around our feet as we washed another stack of plates. Chase was impatient. At 8, he thought himself old enough to help with the harvest. No siree, Bob. Paralee put her foot down. Those machines are no place for children. Chase had to content himself with running cold drinks out to the field. He carried water in crockery jugs, wrapped in burlap, and stashed them in shocks to keep them cool. He marked the shocks with a bundle of straw laid crossways on top so the workers could easily find them. Once, after he made a trip out with refilled jugs, I spotted a tiny figure standing on top of the thresher with Karl. I didn't say a word to Paralee. Let's sit a minute before we do one more thing. Paralee sat down, fanning herself with her apron. Besides, Lottie's hungry. Oof, it feels like an oven. I poured lemonade for the 3 of us, and we sat. Leafy had slipped her shoes and stockings off. I did the same. What would the Ladies' Aid Society think? Paralee asked, arching her eyebrows. Then she took off her own footgear and wiggled her bare toes. Who cares? This is heaven. We sat quietly, the only sounds the occasional cry of the curlew and Lottie's contented nursing. Saw Traft Martin riding this way the other day, Leafy said. Well, at least this time he left our fence line alone, said Paralee. She shifted Lottie to her other breast. He came by a few weeks ago, too. I rolled the cool glass against my neck, and it wasn't a social call. He'd try to buy your claim? Asked Leafy. He had the nerve to ask me to sell a while back. I nodded. He wants to build the tipped M into something even bigger than the Circle Ranch. Leafy exhaled hard. What did you tell him? I held up my hands, swollen from the heat, cracked by water and hard work. I said this life was much too glamorous to ever give up. Paralee laughed. Sugar, you are a caution. Leafy's face grew serious. You be careful. It's one thing for me to tell him no. He wouldn't mess with me. But I know. I held up my hand to stop her words from feeding an imagination that had already conjured up what an angry Traft might do. I'm going to hang on until November. You need any help with that hanging on, said Paralee. You say the word. Same on this side of the street, said Leafy. She tipped her head upward. Lord, look at that sky. Black clouds rolled over the plains. I recalled my conversation with Traft. That's not grasshoppers, is it? My heart throbbed in my throat. Don't think so. Leafy pushed herself out of the chair. Rain! Paralee hopped up too and began to gather things together. We better get everything inside. Maddie! She waved her apron. You and Fern come on in now. We got everything and all the children except Chase inside just as the sky opened up. That's not rain. I had my forehead pressed to my one window. With all the damp bodies, the room was as steamy as if it was wash day. Oh, Lord. Leafy's hand flew to her chest. Hail! The hard, pea-sized pellets quickly turned to stones the size of eggs. Chase! Paralee ran to the door, jerked it open, and screamed his name. Don't fret. Leafy pulled her back. Karl and them have taken cover. Karl wouldn't let anything happen to that boy. The sky hurled hailstone after hailstone onto my field. Like a pitcher on fire, throwing fastball after fastball, heaven struck me out and good. The cut flax, all neatly windrowed, was the first to be mowed down. Then the wheat, trampled to the ground as if a giant had stomped through, and stomped all over my dreams. I could do nothing but watch and feel my heart break in two. After what felt like hours, the clattering against the roof slowed. Looks like it's over, said Leafy. The door slammed open. Karl, Wayne Robbins, and Chase burst inside. Karl! Paralee rushed to him. Blood dribbled down his forehead. Blasted things the size of oranges, said Wayne, and hard as coal. While Paralee tended to Karl, I set about making some tea. Nice and sweet, I said, handing a mug to the shivering Chase. This will help. I closed my eyes. The tea could warm a frozen boy, but what could help me? Chase took a shaky sip. Karl threw me under the tractor. All he and Wayne could do was cover their heads with their arms. The quiet was as powerful as the drum of hail had been moments before. I looked out through the open doorway. My kitchen garden was in shambles. Part of the chicken coop roof slumped against the well pump. Albert and the girls huddled, no worse for the wear, under the coop. The sunflower I'd been nursing along was broken in half, the yellow petals pummeled into the dirt. I forced myself out the door and toward the fields. Wayne Robbins followed me, shaking his head. White Reaper, my dad called it, he said as we took in the destruction. The flax is done, Hattie, but you can save some of the wheat. His voice went down at the end, as if he was trying to convince himself of his own words. Sell it for feed? Feed? During all my months of ciphering, I had counted on selling my grain to the miller at grain prices, not to the odd farmer as cattle feed. You won't be the only one, Hattie. Wayne no doubt meant his words to comfort, but they only added to my worries. How many other fields were destroyed by this hailstorm? There could be dozens of us trying to salvage what we could. How many farmers were there who needed to buy feed? Not as many as would need to sell it, that was certain. Tears burned at my eyes, but I would not let them fall. What good would they be anyway? I bucked up and we salvaged. Karl drove the hay wagon, pulled stoically by Joey, Star, Sage, and Plug through the ravaged fields. One small section of wheat on a little dogleg of my land had escaped the storm. Wayne, Chase, and I wielded pitchforks to lift the bundles there, not nearly enough, onto the wagon. Leafy patiently fed small loads into the thresher. I had laid in a huge store of gunny sacks, hoping to fill them all with the threshed grain. Normally, Karl had said, it would take 3 men to keep up with the thresher's output, filling the gunny sacks and stitching them with exactly 7 stitches before tossing them onto the grain wagon. Today, thanks to the White Reaper, Wayne Robbins alone could keep up with the task. Later, I wrote about it to Charlie. As I thanked my neighbors at the end of the day, I felt as if I was at a funeral. And in a way, it was. A funeral for a dream. How could months of work be destroyed in a few minutes? After I finished the letter, I got out the ledger and turned to this month's entry. I had been so smug with Traft the other day, when the hope of a harvest was in sight. Now I totted up numbers this way and that. No matter which way I did the math, I owed more than I'd make. Even with my newspaper money, I'd be in the hole. How was I going to repay the binders, the threshers, Mr. Nevsger for the fence IOU, and the seed? The only bright spot in the whole mess was that I wouldn't have to make payment on the $100 war stamps pledge, and that only made me feel ashamed, not relieved. I brewed myself a cup of tea. Mr. Whiskers must have sensed how low I was feeling. He hopped up in my lap, purring his comfort and encouragement. There's a way. I ran over the numbers one more time, besides Traft. I scratched Mr. Whiskers behind the ears. I prayed, I quilted, and prayed some more. No answer came. As much as I wanted to throw myself a pity party, I couldn't. I did my chores, tried to revive my sad little garden, cleaned the chicken coop, put a pot of beans on to simmer for supper. Mucking out the barn, I saw Uncle Chester's chest. I put down the pitchfork and knelt in front of it, stroking the initials on the front. I leaned over, resting my cheek on the top of the chest, trying to draw comfort from it. Uncle Chester had believed in me. I'd believed in myself. I need to know what to do. I fiddled with the latches. It'd break my heart and yours to sell out to Traft. Wiping my eyes, I sat up and opened the trunk. Maybe I'd missed something the first time I'd gone through it. Maybe there was a stash of money in the linings for a time like this. Hadn't he called himself a scoundrel? Didn't scoundrels usually have ill-gotten gains lying around somewhere? This time, I carefully inspected every inch of that chest. I took each item out one by one and set it next to me. When everything was out, I felt the lining, hoping to brush a secret trigger as I probed. There were no secret compartments, no secret stashes to be found. It had been foolish even to hope, but desperation will make you believe almost anything. Carefully, I replaced the contents in the trunk. As I set an old copy of The Last of the Mohicans back inside, I noticed something edged out beyond the pages. I flipped the book open. Oh! I sat back on my haunches and stared into the photo in my hands. It was of my mother and my father. Mother held a baby in her lap. Me. Another man stood back of mother. I turned the photo over for an explanation. Me, Catherine, and Raymond with baby Hattie, January 1902. I stared into the face of that 3-month-old infant. So sweet, so happy, so hopeful. Then I gazed into the faces of my parents. I could almost hear my mother singing to me and feel the tickle of my father's beard against my cheek. I pressed my lips to the picture and held it there for several seconds. Then I looked at the other man. I knew from the tight and slanted script on the back who it was, Uncle Chester. I studied his face. Was there any hint of disappointment there? Blame? All I could see was a warm and encouraging smile, maybe even an understanding smile. I carefully tucked the photograph back in the book. The remaining items were returned to the trunk. I closed it up and did the latches. "Thank you, Uncle Chester," I whispered. Finding that photo today, on my lowest of days, was another one of Uncle Chester's gifts. I only wish I knew what it meant.